Why is horror worth talking about? I mean, isn't it all
the same? Some stupid killer stalking some big-breasted girl who can't act, who's always running up the stairs when she should be going out the front door. It's insulting.
Heck and no. This is Proper Horror Show, where I love to look at horror and show it as a worthy genre. One of the things that counters the bad reputation of horror is the depth of some horror films and their dual purpose of theme, allegory, and messaging. What I'm saying is that a lot of horror is not just a dumb slasher flick, although, you know, I am totally down for that, you know. You've seen my Friday the 13th video. But what horror is not widely appreciated for is the fact that often it does carry a really interesting message, sometimes by the themes or sometimes by an allegory. Now, these are not always explicit, you know. I've referenced often my hot take that Texas Chainsaw Massacre is actually perfectly functioning as a vegan horror film. I really need to make a video about that. But how do you see if your hot take interpretation of a horror film is correct? Well, you identify the key elements of the film, so whether that's in the themes or the plot, the mechanics, the characters, and you just see if they map to your theory. There are some really well-known examples of that, less controversial than my theory that Texas Chainsaw Massacre is a vegan horror film, my theory that Nightmare on Elm Street is largely about the intergenerational reactions to the Vietnam War. Yes, really? You've seen it in the famous King Kong scene in Inglourious Basterds, which I'm not going to risk a copyright claim for, or the numerous articles that were claiming Inception is all about filmmaking itself. That's actually a theory that I find very convincing, but I'm not going to rehash that here. Instead, I'm going to stick to the horror genre, and to demonstrate, we're going to take a popular, if slightly mysterious horror film, a variety of hot takes, and see if logically it follows. Do you get it? Yeah, you get it. Now, horror, of course, has a long history of social messaging because they originate largely in the sort of folk and fairy tale background, which was all about conveying a simple message. Think back to, you know, Red Riding Hood and the warning to young girls to beware mysterious men, or Hansel and Gretel telling you to kill your stepmother. There's a long history of using these stories to promote social messaging, and that has continued. Horror is, of course, really fertile ground for that because every horror film has a threat of some kind. So it's simple messaging to use that to send a warning about something that is a current issue. Well, would you look at that? It follows. Now, I really love this film. This scared the absolute heck out of me when I saw it in the cinema in 2015. Now, the director, David Robert Mitchell, has said repeatedly that while he's really interested in playing with the themes of sex and death that are so frequently a part of horror films, he wanted to play with them, he wanted to recontextualize them, and he wanted to essentially kind of confound the traditional thinking. Maybe slightly counterintuitively, what he has said is that everything happens within a dream logic, or rather a nightmare logic, so things do not lend themselves to a coherent interpretation.
I was wondering if any earlier incarnations of the script had more of a mythology for the followers, or if it was always left out.
No, never. I never wanted anyone to it to be explained. You know, for me, in this story, the act of trying to understand it or comprehend something that is truly a nightmare would place it in the realm of a film.
So from the writer and director's own mouth, he is saying, Tolkien style, there is no allegory.
To solve it is outside of the realm of like a dream or nightmare.
But bad news for him, death of the author applies, so we are going fully into this. Okay, analysis mode. The basic plot of It Follows is that the protagonist has a sexual encounter which leaves her with a curse that she struggles to rid herself of. The curse, in effect, is that she is followed by an unspeaking entity whose appearance changes constantly. She is the only person who can see it, although it can have a physical effect on the world, and it will pursue her until it catches and kills her. She can temporarily relieve the curse by sleeping with someone else and passing it on to them. However, when the entity catches this person and kills them, it will then go back to pursuing her, sort of working back down the chain. That is the basic plot of the film. I'm not going to give any details about the resolution of it because I think you should just watch it and enjoy it. It's a really good horror film that is, I think, very unsettling, has some very unique imagery, and it really worked for me. Maybe a little too well. I was genuinely shaking in the cinema, so it was a great experience. But for the purposes of this video, we want to talk about what we can read into the film if It Follows actually has a coherent message, if it has an allegory behind it. Basic elements that we need to analyze to understand It Follows and apply our own hot take are: the issue is sexually transmitted, it follows you around, the threat is unseen by others, you can gain temporary relief by passing it on to others, but it will come back. The threat also changes visually and is mostly in the form of different people. Okay, so the most obvious interpretation is probably the one you went straight for the second I said that the threat was sexually transmitted: STDs. So let's actually compare it to the basic elements. Now, yeah, the STD is within you, so that follows you around, okay, sexually transmitted, of course, but that's when we run into trouble very quickly. You know, I think it's why a lot of people say that really doesn't work. So if It Follows is about STDs, then how does passing it on to others help you? There are mistaken beliefs worldwide that can cure HIV by sleeping with a virgin, but I really don't think that's what the director's going for here. There's also the problem of STDs not being visible to others. I mean, it obviously varies by the particular strain, but lots of STDs are visually represented, so it fails on that point. And the big problem essentially is that lots of them are curable. So within this logic of, you know, a magical curse, your protagonist would treat it with a magical cure. So that allegory really does not hold any water, so we are going to junk that one. Death of the author, option 2. It follows as an allegory for sexual trauma. Okay, so something that can result from sexual encounter. That's good, that matches. It also kind of tragically matches in that you might pass on the problem. It's a very sad fact that survivors of abuse and trauma often become perpetrators, so that fits here. However, temporary relief, that element isn't the greatest match. Sexual trauma, abuse, it is something that affects you but isn't visible to others most of the time. And there is a very good match here in that, like the protagonist, you might end up distrusting other people. Just random people on the street might suddenly seem to be a threat. Now that's quite promising. Big problem with using sexual trauma as a basis for the allegory is that the untreatable angle doesn't work, and the threat cycling back to you also doesn't work here. On the other hand, there is also something supportive in that the protagonist has a problem convincing other people of the threat. It's kind of grim, but you know, that matches quite well. I think what we have here is a better match than the STD analysis, even if it's not perfect. So looking at the last angle for this will be a bit more controversial. In 2015, when It Follows was made, I think we can say fairly uncontroversially that the prevailing popular culture is in a mood of sexual liberalism. I don't think I'm going out on a limb by going with that. So what if the film is actually cautioning against that? Particularly, what if It Follows is a criticism of hookup culture? It's not the analysis I've seen anyone else make. I'm probably not the first, but I haven't seen anyone else take this read on the film. Let's look at It Follows through that lens. What if It Follows is criticizing hookup culture? Okay, it's not as obvious as an STD, but the protagonist is badly affected by a consensual hookup with a guy that she doesn't know well. The after effects of this sexual encounter follow her around, and she's very aware of people watching her, and that's threatening. Remembering that the threat is unseen by other people, that really works as symbolism for something that's an internal problem or an internalized problem. It's a psychological issue for her. It's within her own mind. So again, we've got another match. And how does our protagonist gain some relief for the problem that she's having? Well, she goes on to sleep with other people, and that gives her a temporary respite. But ultimately, it's not solving her problem, and in a way, it adds to her unease, because while she feels a brief respite, she knows the problem isn't gone, and she knows it might come back to her. Essentially, how can I put this? Essentially, sorry Peaches, you can't fuck the pain away. I'm sure there's a catchy song which kind of covers the basis of her problem here. So if the threat isn't sexually transmitted diseases or the after effects of sexual trauma, but a psychological unease and shame following an encounter that, ultimately was maybe a bit too much too soon, or not a great choice, then this maps well. Maybe the entity here appearing as different people is representing that idea of feeling yourself being judged by other people, but also being haunted by a parade of different people that you've hooked up with, that you've had a sexual encounter with, that you then go on to regret. And tellingly, the parents in the film are very notably absent, but are seen as one of the faces of the entity. This happens a couple of times. And if that doesn't fuel the interpretation of this as shame, then I don't know what does. That feels like it's spoon-feeding the imagery to us a little bit there. So having laid that out there, does that mean the film is promoting abstinence? I really don't think so. That's jumping from one extreme to the other, but I think we can coherently read It Follows as maybe a more experienced, older person's criticism cautioning against the risks of a contemporary social trend, this trend of excess liberalism and insufficient caution. Or maybe It Follows is about crab people. I don't know. So there's my guide on how to get a flaming hot take on a horror film. I hope that was helpful. If you enjoyed this sort of thing, this channel is super tiny, so every subscription is super welcome. Thanks, y'all. Bye.
Durango 95 purred away real horror show.